Have you ever wondered why some families seem cursed? Why certain bloodlines carry darkness like an inheritance, passed down from father to son like a terrible heirloom? Let me tell you about the Thornwell family of Ashwood County, Kentucky, and perhaps you'll understand why some secrets should remain buried, and why some invitations should never be accepted. My name is Margaret Holloway, though by the time you hear this tale, that name will mean nothing. In the autumn of 1851, I was 23 years old, unmarried, a concerning state for a woman of my age in those times, and working as a governess for the Weatherby family in Louisville. It was there, in that comfortable brownstone on 3rd Street, that I first heard the name Thornwell. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider whose horse was so thoroughly exhausted it collapsed in the courtyard. The man himself wasn't in much better condition. His clothes were covered in road dust, his face gaunt from hard riding, and his eyes, God help me, his eyes held a kind of terror I'd never seen before. He thrust the letter into my hands with trembling fingers and spoke only 4 words before fleeing. "Don't go there, miss." But the letter itself was perfectly proper, written in an elegant hand on expensive paper that smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something earthier, like freshly turned soil. It was from Mrs. Constance Thornwell of Thornwell Manor, requesting my services as a governess for her 3 sons. The compensation offered was extraordinary. Triple what the Weatherbys paid me, plus room and board in what she described as one of Kentucky's finest ancestral homes. Mrs. Weatherby was in the drawing room when I brought her the letter, seeking her counsel. The moment she read the name Thornwell, the color drained from her face. She set down her teacup with such force that it cracked clean through. "Margaret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you must not accept this position." When I pressed her for reasons, she walked to the window and stared out at the street for a long moment before speaking again. "The Thornwell men are cursed, child. Every woman who has married into that family for the past 3 generations has died on her wedding night. Every single one. I should have listened. God knows I should have listened. But I was young, educated, and foolishly confident in my rationality. Curses were superstition, nothing more. Besides, I wasn't going there to marry anyone. I was going to teach children. What harm could come from that? Mrs. Weatherby tried once more to dissuade me. She told me about the Thornwell estate, isolated in the hills of eastern Kentucky, surrounded by forests so thick that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. She spoke of the local people who crossed themselves when the family name was mentioned, of the strange lights seen in the manor windows on moonless nights, of the way animals refused to set foot on Thornwell land. "There are 3 brothers," she said, gripping my hands. "James, the eldest at 32, William at 28, and Thomas, 25. All widowers. All their wives died the same way, found in their marriage beds at dawn, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, without a mark on their bodies. The local physician could never determine the cause of death. But the salary was too tempting and my pride too great. I wrote my acceptance that very evening, though I noticed my hand trembled slightly as I sealed the letter. 3 days later, a carriage arrived, black as midnight, pulled by 4 black horses with eyes that seemed too intelligent, too aware. The driver never spoke, merely nodded when I gave him my trunk and opened the carriage door with a gloved hand that seemed too thin, too long to be entirely natural. The journey took 2 days. We traveled east, then north, the roads growing progressively worse as we left civilization behind. The forest grew denser, older, pressing in on both sides of the narrow road like it was trying to reclaim the path. By the 2nd day, we hadn't passed another soul for hours. The trees here were different. Twisted, ancient things with bark like dried blood and branches that seemed to reach toward the carriage with grasping fingers. It was nearly dusk when I first saw Thornwell Manor. It rose from the hillside like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. 3 stories of gray stone and dark timber, with windows that reflected the dying light like eyes full of tears. The architecture was wrong somehow, angles that didn't quite make sense, proportions that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. A tower rose from the eastern wing, its top lost in low-hanging clouds that never seemed to move, regardless of the wind. As we approached, I saw them, 3 figures standing on the front steps, perfectly still, waiting. Even from a distance, I could tell they were handsome men, all sharing the same dark hair, the same tall, lean build, the same way of standing that suggested both elegance and something predatory. They didn't wave or call out in greeting. They simply watched our approach with an intensity that made my skin prickle. The carriage stopped, and suddenly I understood the rider's warning. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to stay inside, to demand the driver turn around and take me back to Louisville. But pride and rationality won out. I was here to teach children, nothing more. I stepped out of the carriage and into the shadow of Thornwell Manor, not knowing I was crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. James Thornwell was the first to speak, descending the steps with a grace that seemed almost rehearsed. Up close, I could see his eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue, almost gray, with something moving in their depths like clouds before a storm. He took my hand, and his touch was ice-cold despite the warm evening. "Miss Holloway," he said, his voice cultured and smooth as aged whiskey. "We've been expecting you. Welcome to Thornwell Manor." William came next, younger but somehow seeming older, worn down by something I couldn't name. His eyes were darker than his brother's, brown like freshly turned earth, and when he smiled, it didn't reach them. "You're very brave to come here, Miss Holloway. Very brave indeed." Thomas, the youngest, said nothing at all. He simply stared at me with green eyes that held a fever brightness, his lips moving slightly as if in silent prayer or conversation with someone I couldn't see. Of the 3, he frightened me most, though I couldn't say why. "Come," James said, gesturing toward the house. "Mother is waiting." The interior of Thornwell Manor was even more unsettling than its exterior. The entrance hall stretched impossibly high, lit by chandeliers that cast more shadows than light. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Thornwell men, all with those same sharp features, all with wives whose faces had been painted over with black paint. Every single one. "A family tradition," William said, noticing my stare. "We don't speak of the dead in this house." But that was a lie I would soon learn. The dead were all they spoke of, in whispers and glances, in the spaces between words. Mrs. Constance Thornwell waited in the drawing room, a space decorated in burgundy and gold that should have been warm but felt like the inside of a tomb. She was a small woman, made smaller by the high-backed chair she occupied, dressed entirely in black bombazine that rustled like dead leaves when she moved. Her face might have been beautiful once, but grief had carved deep lines around her mouth and eyes, and her hair, though perfectly arranged, was white as bone. "Miss Holloway," she said, and her voice was like wind through empty rooms. "How good of you to come. I trust your journey was uneventful." There was something in the way she said it, a weight to the word uneventful, that made me wonder what events she might have expected. I assured her it had been fine, though I didn't mention the strange dreams I'd had in the carriage. Dreams of women in white nightgowns running through the forest, their mouths open in silent screams. "Excellent. You'll want to know about your charges, of course." She gestured to a portrait above the fireplace, 3 young boys, perhaps between 5 and 10 years old, all with the distinctive Thornwell features. James's son, Samuel, is 8. William's boy, Peter, is 7. And Thomas's child, Paul, is 6. I studied the portrait, noting the serious expressions on such young faces. They're handsome boys. Where are they now? I'm eager to meet them. The silence that followed my question was complete. Even the fire in the grate seemed to stop crackling. The 3 brothers exchanged glances I couldn't interpret, and Mrs. Thornwell's hands tightened on the arms of her chair until her knuckles went white. "They're indisposed this evening," James finally said. "You'll meet them tomorrow. They keep unusual hours, you understand. Country children." But there was nothing of country children in this place. Everything felt rehearsed, careful, like they were all actors in a play and I was the only one who didn't know my lines. Dinner was a strange affair. The dining room was vast, lit by candelabras that threw dancing shadows on the walls. We sat at one end of a table that could have seated 30, the empty chairs stretching away into darkness. The food was excellent: roasted pheasant, vegetables from the garden, wine that tasted of summer fruits, but no one seemed to eat. They watched me, all four of them, with an intensity that made every bite difficult to swallow. "Tell us about yourself, Miss Holloway," William said, refilling my wine glass for the third time. "Have you any family? Anyone who might miss you if you were to stay longer than expected?" "I have a sister in Boston," I said carefully. "We correspond regularly." "How nice," Mrs. Thornwell murmured. "Family is so important, so very important to maintain connections." Thomas laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. "Connections. Yes, Mother. Connections that bind us all." After dinner, Mrs. Thornwell showed me to my room on the second floor. It was beautiful. A four-poster bed with burgundy curtains, a writing desk by the window, a wardrobe that could have held 3 times my simple possessions. But there were things that weren't right. The mirror was covered with a black cloth. The windows had been nailed shut, and on the back of the door, someone had scratched words into the wood. "They come through the walls." "Pay no mind to that," Mrs. Thornwell said, though I hadn't mentioned it. "The previous governess was troubled. We should have had it sanded down." "What happened to her?" I asked. Mrs. Thornwell's smile was thin as paper. "She left quite suddenly. A family emergency, I believe. Now, there are rules you must follow, Miss Holloway. Very important rules." She listed them with the gravity of someone reciting commandments. "Never leave your room after midnight. Never go to the 3rd floor. Never enter the tower. Always wear the iron cross she would give me. Never, under any circumstances, was I to speak to the children about their mothers." "Why?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Because," she said, moving to the door, "the dead don't always stay dead in this house, Miss Holloway, and sometimes the living aren't quite alive. Sweet dreams." She left me there, in that beautiful, terrible room, with only the sound of my own heartbeat and the whisper of wind through the trees outside. No, not wind. It sounded like voices, like women crying, like fingernails scratching at wood. I didn't sleep that first night. I sat in the chair by the covered mirror, clutching the iron cross Mrs. Thornwell had given me, and waited for dawn. Morning came like a blessing, pale light filtering through the heavy curtains to chase away the shadows that had seemed so alive in the darkness. I dressed quickly, eager to begin my duties and establish some normalcy in this strange place. Surely, I thought, the children would be ordinary boys, untouched by whatever madness gripped their fathers. I was catastrophically wrong. I found them in what Mrs. Thornwell called the schoolroom, though it bore no resemblance to any place of learning I'd ever seen. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with symbols and diagrams that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe, astronomical charts depicting no constellations I recognized, and writings in languages that predated any I'd studied. The 3 boys sat at their desks, backs perfectly straight, hands folded, staring at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for their young faces. They wore identical black suits, like miniature versions of their fathers, and their hair was slicked back with pomade that smelled of funeral flowers. "Good morning, boys," I said, trying to inject warmth into my voice. "I'm Miss Holloway, your new governess." They responded in perfect unison, their voices creating an unsettling harmony. "Good morning, Miss Holloway. We've been waiting for you." Samuel, the eldest, had his father's storm-gray eyes, but in his child's face they seemed ancient, weary. Peter, William's son, smiled constantly, but it was the smile of someone enjoying a private joke at your expense. And Paul, Thomas's boy, never blinked. Not once in that entire first lesson did I see him blink. "What were you studying with your previous governess?" I asked, moving to examine the books on their desks. The texts were wrong. Some were in Latin, which wasn't unusual, but the Latin was corrupt, twisted, speaking of things that should not be. Others were in languages I couldn't identify, filled with diagrams of human anatomy that showed impossible additions, extra organs that served no purpose I could fathom, bone structures that couldn't exist in nature. "Mother says we must prepare," Samuel said, his voice eerily mature. "The alignment approaches." "What alignment?" I asked, but they only smiled those terrible, knowing smiles. I tried to establish a normal routine. Mathematics, history, literature subjects any well-bred boys should know. But they already knew everything I could teach them and more. When I gave them arithmetic problems, they solved equations that shouldn't have been possible for children their age. When I taught history, they corrected my dates and added details about events that no history book contained. Details that, when I later researched them, proved horrifyingly accurate. During our geography lesson, Paul drew a map of the estate and surrounding area from memory. But he included things that weren't there or weren't supposed to be there. Extra buildings that didn't exist, paths through the forest that led to places marked only with symbols, and beneath the manor itself, a vast network of tunnels and chambers extending deep into the earth. "What are these?" I asked, pointing to the underground structures. "The old rooms," Peter said, his constant smile widening. "Where the brides go." "Where the brides went," Samuel corrected. "They don't go anywhere anymore. They can't leave." A chill ran through me. "Your mother's." The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. The boys' faces went pale, their eyes wide with what looked like terror. "We don't speak of them," Paul whispered, finally blinking. "They listen. They're always listening." That afternoon, I tried to take them outside for some fresh air and normal childhood activity. The grounds of Thornwell Manor were extensive but oppressive. The gardens were meticulously maintained yet wrong. Flowers bloomed out of season, their colors too vivid, their scents too sweet. The hedge maze at the garden's heart was so complex that looking at it too long made my head spin. The boys refused to play. They stood in a perfect line, watching the forest's edge with an intensity that made me nervous. "What are you looking at?" I asked. "They're coming closer," Samuel said. "Every year, they come closer." "Who?" "Our mothers," Peter giggled, though there was no humor in it. "They want their children back." That evening at dinner, I couldn't contain my concerns. The boys were clearly disturbed, filled with morbid fantasies about their deceased mothers. They needed help, professional help, not just a governess. The reaction to my carefully worded suggestion was immediate and terrible. Thomas stood so quickly his chair toppled backward, his green eyes blazing with fever brightness. "You know nothing," he snarled. "Nothing of what we've sacrificed, what we've endured." "Thomas," James said quietly, but his brother was beyond reasoning. "She thinks we're mad, just like the others. But she'll see. Oh, she'll see when the moon is dark. She'll see what comes through the walls, what whispers in the corridors, what waits in the marriage beds." William grabbed his brother's arm, pulling him back. "Enough. You're frightening Miss Holloway." "She should be frightened," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow worse than his shouting. "We all should be. They're getting stronger. The boundaries are weakening. And when the alignment comes—" "Enough!" Mrs. Thornwell's voice cracked like a whip. I'd never heard her raise her voice before, and the effect was immediate. Thomas fell silent, sinking back into his chair like a puppet with cut strings. "Miss Holloway," she said, her composure restored, "perhaps you should retire early this evening. The boys can be overwhelming at first." I didn't argue. I fled to my room, locking the door behind me and pushing a chair against it for good measure. But locks and chairs couldn't keep out the sounds that began after midnight. Footsteps in the hallway that stopped at my door, whispers and voices that sounded young and female, and worst of all, the sound of children crying somewhere in the walls. I pulled the cover from the mirror, desperate for any sense of normalcy, and immediately wished I hadn't. In the reflection, I could see my room, but it wasn't empty. 3 women in wedding gowns stood behind my chair, their faces obscured by veils, their hands reaching toward me. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, they were closer. I covered it again and spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, clutching the iron cross and praying for dawn, finally understanding that the Thornwell curse was no superstition. Something evil lived in this house, something that had claimed 3 brides and wouldn't rest until it claimed more. The next morning brought rain, a torrential downpour that turned the world outside the windows into a gray blur. I found Mrs. Thornwell in the library, a cavernous room that smelled of old leather and decay. She sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames with an expression of such profound sadness that I almost turned away. But I needed answers. "Mrs. Thornwell," I began, "I believe I deserve to know the truth about this family, about what happened to the boys' mothers." She was silent for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at me, she began to speak in a voice heavy with exhaustion. "My husband, Silas Thornwell, was a learned man. Too learned, perhaps. He studied things that should remain unstudied, sought knowledge that should stay hidden. In his tower, the one you must never enter, he conducted experiments, performed rituals, trying to pierce the veil between worlds." She stood, moving to a portrait covered with a black cloth. With one swift motion, she pulled it away, revealing a man with the distinctive Thornwell features but something else too. A hunger in his eyes that seemed almost alive in the painted face. "He succeeded," she continued. "He found a way to extend life, to cheat death itself. But everything has a price, Miss Holloway. The ritual required sacrifice, specifically the life force of a woman bound to the family by marriage. On the wedding night, when the bond was strongest, the essence would be harvested." My blood turned to ice. "You're saying he murdered?" "No," she interrupted. "Not murdered. It's worse than that. The women don't die, not truly. Their bodies do, yes, but their spirits remain, trapped between worlds, neither living nor dead. They exist in agony, aware but unable to move on, bound to the family that betrayed them. James's wife, Catherine," she continued, walking to another covered portrait. "So young, so beautiful. She loved him truly. William's bride, Eleanor, a doctor's daughter with a quick wit and kind heart. And Thomas's Sarah." Her voice broke. "Sarah was my niece. I brought her here, encouraged the match. I killed her as surely as if I'd held the knife myself." "But Silas is dead," I said. "Surely the curse died with him?" Mrs. Thornwell laughed, a bitter sound. "Silas isn't dead, Miss Holloway. He's in the tower, sustained by the life force he stole. He's been there for 15 years, neither living nor dying, conducting his experiments, seeking a way to make the immortality permanent without the need for constant sacrifice. And your sons know this? They know. They've known since childhood. Each of them fell in love, married despite knowing the curse, hoping that their love would be strong enough to break it. Each of them held their dead brides at dawn and knew they were responsible." She turned to me then, and I saw tears streaming down her face. "The boys, my grandsons, they're different because they were born of cursed unions. They exist partially in both worlds, able to see and hear their mother's spirits. It's driving them mad." "Then why did you bring me here?" I demanded. "Why expose me to this horror?" "Because the alignment Samuel spoke of is real. Every 20 years, the boundaries between worlds grow thin. The last time it happened, Silas performed his ritual. This time the trapped spirits will have their chance for revenge. But they won't stop with Silas. They'll take everyone with Thornwell blood, including the children. Unless," I could hear the desperation in her voice before she spoke, "unless we find a woman willing to marry one of my sons and break the curse. The ritual can be reversed, but only by a willing sacrifice, a bride who knows the truth and chooses love anyway. Her willing death would free the trapped spirits and end Silas's unholy existence." I stood abruptly, anger flooding through me. "So you brought me here as a sacrificial lamb? Hoped I'd fall in love with one of your sons and die for them?" "No!" She grabbed my hands, her grip surprisingly strong. "I brought you here because you're strong, educated, rational. I thought if anyone could find another way, it would be you. There must be another way. There has to be." Thunder crashed overhead, and in that moment, I heard it, screaming from somewhere above us. Not the wind, not the storm, but human voices in agony. The boys came running into the library, their faces white with terror. "Grandfather is calling them," Samuel gasped. "He's calling the brides." The walls began to shake. Books fell from their shelves. The fire in the grate turned blue, then white, then a color that shouldn't exist. And through it all, I could hear him, Silas Thornwell, his voice carrying down from the tower, speaking words in that twisted language I'd seen in the boys' textbooks. "Take the children to the cellar," Mrs. Thornwell commanded. "Lock them in the iron room. It's the only place their mothers can't reach." As I herded the terrified boys from the library, I caught a glimpse of something that would haunt me forever. In every reflective surface, windows, mirrors, even the polished wood of the floor, I could see them. 3 women in wedding gowns, their veils lifted to reveal faces twisted in rage and anguish, their mouths open in eternal screams. They were coming, and nothing in heaven or hell would stop them from claiming what was theirs. The boys clung to me as we ran through the corridors, portraits crashing from walls, chandeliers swaying violently overhead. Behind us, always behind us, came the whisper of silk on stone, wedding dresses dragging across the floor, getting closer with each passing second. "They want us back," Paul sobbed. "They want to take us with them into the dark." We reached the cellar door just as the temperature plummeted so dramatically that ice formed on the walls. I yanked it open and practically threw the boys down the stairs, following close behind. The iron room Mrs. Thornwell had mentioned was at the cellar's far end. A chamber lined entirely with iron plates, symbols etched into every surface. I shoved the boys inside and slammed the door, sliding the heavy iron bolt home. Through the small window, I could see their terrified faces. "Stay here," I commanded. "No matter what you hear, don't open this door. Don't leave us," Peter cried, his constant smile finally gone. "I'll come back," I promised, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "I swear I'll come back." I turned to find myself face to face with William. He stood at the cellar stairs, his earth-brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Determination, perhaps, or resignation. "Miss Holloway," he said quietly, "I have a proposition for you." William led me to his study, a room I'd never entered before. Unlike the rest of the manor, it felt almost normal: books on architecture and engineering, blueprints spread across a drafting table, a half-built model of what looked like a new wing for the house. This was a room where someone tried to live a life, to plan for a future. "You've seen them," he said, pouring himself brandy with shaking hands. "Our wives, our victims. Your mother told me everything," I said. "About the curse, the ritual, your father." He laughed bitterly. "Did she tell you about the first time we saw them? The morning after each wedding? James found Catherine standing at the foot of their bed, still in her gown, smiling at him. He thought she'd recovered, that the curse had failed. It wasn't until he touched her and his hand passed right through that he understood. She stood there for hours, just smiling, before she started screaming. He drained his glass and poured another. Eleanor was different. She wrote messages in the frost on windows, in the dust on mirrors. Why? Over and over. Why? As if I could explain why I'd let my father murder her for his immortality. And Sarah? William's face darkened. Sarah tears things apart. Books, curtains, furniture, anything she can affect. She's the angriest, probably because Thomas knew exactly what would happen and married her anyway. He thought if he didn't consummate the marriage, the ritual wouldn't work. He was wrong. Outside, the storm was worsening. Lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes, and in each brief moment of brightness, I could see shapes at the windows. Pale faces pressed against the glass, hands leaving frost patterns that spelled out words I didn't want to read. "Your proposition," I reminded him, trying to ignore the supernatural display. William moved to the drafting table, pulling out a leather journal. "I've been researching for 7 years, ever since Eleanor. Since that night, I found references to similar curses, other families who bargained with forces beyond our world. Most ended in total destruction, but there was one, a family in Romania, who found a way to break free." He opened the journal, showing me pages covered in his neat handwriting, diagrams, and calculations. "The curse is bound to the tower. That's where Father performed the original ritual, where he maintains his existence. If we destroy the tower completely, bring it down stone by stone, the connection breaks. That seems too simple, I said skeptically. It's not. He turned to another page. The tower exists partially outside normal space. That's why you must never enter. The geometry inside doesn't match the outside. There are rooms that shouldn't fit, stairs that go up but lead down, doors that open onto nothing. Destroying it would require entering it, finding the heart where Father conducts his rituals, and setting specific charges at key structural points. You're talking about explosives? In a structure that defies physics. I'm talking about ending this, he said fiercely. My son grows stranger every day. He speaks to his mother constantly, holds full conversations with empty air. Soon he'll be more ghost than boy. I need someone to help me. Someone the spirits won't immediately attack because they have no claim on them. Why should I trust you? I asked. How do I know this isn't another trap? William walked to a locked cabinet and withdrew something wrapped in black cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a silver locket. When he opened it, I saw a portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This was Eleanor's, he said softly. She gave it to me on our wedding day. Inside, she placed a lock of her hair and mine, twisted together. She said it would bind us forever. His voice broke. She was right, just not in the way she meant. He held the locket out to me. Take it. The spirits can't touch anyone carrying a token freely given by the dead. Eleanor gave this with love before she died. It will protect you. I took the locket, feeling its surprising warmth against my palm. When? Tonight, he said. During the storm, the electrical disturbance will mask the explosion, and the rain will prevent the fire from spreading to the main house. But we have to go now, while Father is focused on controlling the spirits. He's summoning them for the alignment, trying to bind them more thoroughly. He'll be distracted. A scream echoed through the house. Not supernatural, but very human. Mrs. Thornwell. We ran from the study, following the sound to the main hall. She stood at the foot of the grand staircase, staring up at something that made my blood freeze. James and Thomas flanked a figure I'd never seen before. An old man, ancient beyond measure. His skin like parchment stretched over bone. His eyes pits of absolute darkness. Silas Thornwell had left his tower. Hello, William, Silas said, his voice like wind through a crypt. I hear you've been plotting against me. How disappointing. And you, Miss Holloway, the woman my wife thought could save us all. How delightfully naive. He descended the stairs with unnatural grace, his sons supporting him. No, not supporting. I realized with horror that James and Thomas weren't moving of their own accord. Their eyes were blank, puppet by their father's will. The alignment begins at midnight, Silas continued. 3 hours from now. I need a new bride for the ritual, someone to renew the bargain for another 20 years. My sons have been disappointingly reluctant to remarry, but perhaps you'll volunteer? The alternative is that I take the boys. Their mixed blood, half living, half spirit, would provide quite a potent sacrifice. You wouldn't, Mrs. Thornwell gasped. Your own grandchildren? Silas smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. I've lived for 90 years, Constance. I've forgotten what family means. All I know is survival. William stepped forward, pulling a revolver from his coat. Let them go, Father. Silas laughed, a sound like breaking bones. Iron bullets? How quaint. He gestured lazily, and the gun flew from William's hand, clattering across the floor. I've had 20 years to perfect my art, boy. You can't stop me. But I could see something Silas couldn't or wouldn't. Behind him, in every mirror, every window, every polished surface, the brides were gathering. Catherine, Eleanor, Sarah. Their faces no longer twisted in rage but focused, determined. They were waiting for something. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime. 9 o'clock. 3 hours, Silas said again, turning his empty gaze on me. Think about it, Miss Holloway. Your life for theirs. It's really quite a generous offer. He gestured again, and James and Thomas collapsed like marionettes with cut strings. Then, moving with that same unnatural grace, He glided back up the stairs toward his tower, leaving us stunned in his wake. William helped his brothers to their feet. They were conscious but dazed, with no memory of the past few minutes. Mrs. Thornwell was sobbing quietly, collapsed in a chair. "We go now," William said to me urgently. "While he thinks he's won. While he's preparing for the ritual. It's our only chance." I looked at the family, broken, cursed, haunted, and made my decision. Get the explosives. I'll get the boys somewhere safe. The iron room in the cellar couldn't hold the boys. Not against their grandfather's power. As William and I prepared for our assault on the tower, gathering his carefully prepared explosives and the tools we'd need, we could hear Silas calling to them in a language that predated human speech. The boys walked out of their protective cage as if in a trance, the iron bolt sliding back of its own accord. "We have to follow them," William said, strapping a satchel of dynamite across his chest. "He'll use them in the ritual if we don't stop him." The tower entrance had always been locked, but tonight it stood open, revealing a spiral staircase that ascended into darkness. The moment we crossed the threshold, I understood what William meant about the geometry being wrong. The stairs seemed to go up, but I could feel us descending. The walls curved in ways that hurt to look at directly, and doorways opened onto rooms that couldn't possibly exist in the same space. The boys were ahead of us, walking with mechanical precision, their footsteps echoing in patterns that didn't match their movement. We followed, trying to stay close but not interfere. If we broke Silas's concentration too early, before we could set the charges, he might simply kill us all. The first landing opened onto a laboratory that belonged in a nightmare. Tables covered with anatomical diagrams of things that weren't quite human. Jars filled with preserved specimens that moved despite being clearly dead. And the books, shelf after shelf of volumes bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. "Keep moving," William whispered. But I saw him place the first charge against a supporting beam that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. We climbed higher, or perhaps deeper. Direction had lost all meaning in this space. The second landing held prison cells, their bars made of that same cold iron that lined the protective room. But these cells weren't empty. In each one, a translucent figure stood motionless. Women in clothing from different eras, all wearing wedding rings, all with the same expression of confused horror. "Former Mrs. Thornwell's," William said grimly. "Going back generations. He's been doing this far longer than we knew." The trapped spirits turned to watch us pass, their mouths moving in silent pleas. I wanted to help them, but there was nothing I could do except ensure no one else joined their ranks. The third landing was the worst. It was a nursery, complete with cribs, toys, and rocking chairs that moved on their own. But the cribs held things that weren't quite babies. Malformed attempts at life, Silas's experiments in creating perfect vessels for his immortality. They mewed softly as we passed, reaching out with too many fingers, watching with eyes that held ancient intelligence. William was crying as he set another charge. "I never knew. God forgive me. I never knew how far he'd gone." The temperature dropped as we climbed higher, ice forming on the walls. We were approaching the summit, the heart of Silas's power. I could hear him chanting now, his voice reverberating through the impossible architecture. Mixed with it were the boys' voices, reciting responses in that pre-human tongue. The final door was made of wood so black it seemed to absorb light. Symbols carved into its surface writhed and shifted, trying to form patterns that would drive a person mad if they stared too long. William reached for the handle, then stopped. "Once we go in, there's no turning back," he said. "The ritual will already be starting. We'll have minutes at most." I gripped Eleanor's locket tighter. "Then we'd better hurry." The door opened onto a circular chamber that couldn't possibly fit in the tower I'd seen from outside. The walls stretched up into darkness, covered with star charts that showed constellations no earthly astronomer had ever seen. In the center, Silas stood within a circle drawn with what looked like salt mixed with bone dust, the three boys positioned at triangular points around him. But we weren't alone. The brides were there, Catherine, Eleanor, and Sarah, standing just outside the circle, unable to cross but clearly fighting against the barrier. And behind them, dozens of other spirits, the accumulated victims of centuries of Thornwell marriages. Silas looked up as we entered, his hollow eyes reflecting impossible depths. Too late, William. The alignment has begun. He was right. Through the windows that showed views of landscapes that didn't exist on Earth, I could see stars arranging themselves into patterns that hurt to comprehend. Reality was thinning, the barriers between worlds growing gossamer weak. "Release my son," William demanded, moving slowly around the circle's edge, looking for weak points. "Your son," Silas laughed. "These boys are mine now, born of my blood, raised in my house, breathing my air. They were always meant for this, to be vessels for my consciousness when this decrepit form finally fails. 3 bodies, 3 minds, but 1 immortal soul. My soul." The boys began to convulse, their small bodies contorting as something vast and alien tried to force itself inside. That's when I understood the true horror of Silas's plan. He wasn't going to sacrifice them. He was going to possess them, live through them, use their youth to extend his existence for decades more. "No!" Sarah's spirit suddenly shrieked, her voice echoing in both the physical and spiritual realms. "Not my son. Never my son." She threw herself against the barrier, and it flicked red. The other brides joined her, dozens of spectral women pounding against the circle's edge. The salt began to smoke. "The locket," William shouted to me. "Eleanor's locket. Throw it into the circle." Without thinking, I hurled the silver locket over the barrier. It landed at Silas's feet, and where it touched the salt, the circle broke. The spirits flooded in like a tide of vengeance and sorrow. Silas screamed, a sound that shattered every piece of glass in the chamber. He raised his hands, speaking words that reality itself rebelled against hearing. The spirits stopped, frozen mid-lunge, caught between his will and their rage. "Now!" William yelled. "Set the charges while he's distracted." I ran to the supporting pillars William had identified, pressing the dynamite against stones that felt warm and wet like living flesh. Behind me, I could hear the battle, not physical but metaphysical, a war of wills between the living and the dead. The boys had collapsed when the circle broke, lying motionless on the floor. I wanted to go to them, but William grabbed my arm. "The fuses, we have to light them all at once or the explosion won't be synchronized." We worked frantically, connecting the charges with quick-burning cord. Around us, the battle intensified. Silas had drawn power from somewhere deep and wrong, his form expanding, becoming something that wasn't quite human anymore. The spirits attacked relentlessly, but he swatted them aside like insects. Then James spoke from where he lay on the floor, his voice his own but weak. "The books? Burn the books. That's where he stores the stolen life force. Of course, the skin-bound volumes in the laboratory, each one a life taken, a soul trapped." William looked at me, and I knew what he was thinking. Someone had to go back down or up, direction was meaningless here, and destroy them while the other lit the fuses. "Go," I said. "You know where they are better than I do." He hesitated, then pressed a matchbox into my hand. "Light them all. You'll have maybe 3 minutes to get out." He ran from the chamber, leaving me alone with a transforming monster, an army of ghosts, and 3 unconscious children. I struck the first match with trembling fingers. The fuse caught immediately, sparking and hissing as it began its deadly countdown. I lit the next, and the next, working my way around the room as the battle raged. Silas had noticed what I was doing. His attention split between fighting the spirits and stopping me. "Foolish girl!" he roared, sending a bolt of pure darkness my way. I dove aside, feeling it pass inches from my head. Where it struck the wall, stone turned to powder. 2 more fuses to go. The spirits, seeing what I was attempting, redoubled their efforts. Sarah managed to rake spectral claws across Silas's face, drawing not blood but light, pure life force leaking from the wounds. 1 more fuse, but Silas was turning toward the boys, raising his hands for some final, terrible spell. If he couldn't possess them, he'd take their lives to fuel his escape. No! I didn't think, just acted. I threw myself between him and the children, expecting to die. Instead, Eleanor's spirit passed through me, and for a moment, we were one. I felt her love for William, her horror at what had been done to her, her desperate need to protect her son. Together, we faced Silas Thornwell. "You want a bride?" Eleanor spoke through my lips. "Then take me, old man. I'm already dead. Let's see how much life force you can drain from a ghost." We lunged forward, grappling with Silas. The moment our hands touched him, I understood his fundamental mistake. The ritual required a living bride's life force. But Eleanor was already dead, a spirit of pure will and rage. When he tried to drain her, the flow reversed. All the life force he'd stolen over the decades began pouring out of him, back into the spirits of his victims. He aged 100 years in seconds, his skin crumbling like old paper, his bones turning to dust. His final scream was cut short as his throat collapsed into nothing. Eleanor separated from me, and I fell gasping to the floor. Around us, the spirits were changing. No longer twisted by rage, they glowed with soft light. They were free. "The children," Catherine said, her voice like wind chimes. "Take our children and run. The tower won't survive without its master." The building was already shaking, stones grinding against each other. The explosives hadn't even detonated yet, but the tower was collapsing from within, its impossible geometry folding in on itself. I grabbed Paul and Peter while the spirits lifted Samuel, and we ran. The stairs were crumbling beneath our feet, doors opening onto void. I could hear William somewhere below, shouting for us. The spirits guided us, showing us paths that still existed, keeping us one step ahead of the collapse. We burst from the tower entrance just as the fuses ran out. The explosion, when it came, was both physical and metaphysical. A pillar of light and sound that pierced the storm clouds above. The tower didn't just fall. It ceased, erased from reality as if it had never been. William caught us as we tumbled onto the rain-soaked ground, the boys stirring in our arms. Behind us, where the tower had stood, only a perfectly circular patch of glass remained, the earth fused by temperatures that shouldn't have been possible. "The books," I gasped. "Burned," he confirmed. "Every one of them." The boys were waking, blinking in confusion. "Father," Peter said, reaching for William. It was the first time I'd heard any of them use that word. "I'm here," William said, pulling his son close. "I'm here." James and Thomas came running from the house, having been released from Silas's control the moment he died. They gathered their own children, holding them as if they'd never let go. Mrs. Thornwell followed, tears streaming down her face. But the night wasn't over. The spirits still lingered, though they were fading now, becoming translucent as whatever force had trapped them dissipated. The brides approached their former husbands and children, and I held my breath. Catherine reached out to touch James's face, her ghostly hand almost solid for a moment. "I forgive you," she said simply. "Take care of our son." Then she turned to Samuel. "Be better than your father, my love. Be better than all of them." Eleanor stood before William, and they just looked at each other for a long moment. "The locket," she said. "Give it to Peter when he's old enough. Tell him his mother loved him more than life itself." She looked at me. "Thank you for carrying my memory. It gave me strength." Sarah was the last, standing before Thomas with an expression of such mixed love and anger that it was painful to witness. "You knew," she said. "You knew and you married me anyway." "I thought I could save you," Thomas whispered. "I thought love would be enough." "Love is never enough," Sarah said. "But sometimes, forgiveness is." She touched his hand, and for just a moment, they were young again, newly-wed and full of hope. "Raise our son to be honest. No more secrets. No more lies." The spirits began to fade. Not just the three brides, but all the trapped souls from generations past. As they departed, they left something behind. A sense of peace that the manor had never known. The oppressive atmosphere lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. "Miss Holloway," Mrs. Thornwell said, approaching me slowly. I don't know how to thank you." "You can start by telling the truth," I said. exhaustion making me blunt. No more governesses hired under false pretenses. No more secrets. These boys need normal lives, not fairy tales and lies. She nodded, looking older but somehow lighter. You're right, of course. Will you stay? The boys need someone who understands what they've been through. I looked at the three children, no longer the eerie, two knowing creatures I'd first met, but simply boys. Traumatized, certainly, but just boys. They needed help, guidance, and most of all, honesty. I'll stay, I said. But things will be different. No more locked doors, no more covered mirrors, no more rules about what can and can't be discussed. These boys have seen enough darkness. It's time to let in some light. William stepped forward. Miss Holloway, Margaret, I know you've been through something terrible because of my family, but I want you to know what you did tonight. You saved us all. Dawn was breaking, the storm finally passing. Sunlight, real sunlight, touched Thornwell Manor for the first time in decades. The shadows that had seemed so permanent retreated, revealing a house that, while old and strange, was just a house. Over the following weeks, we worked to make it a home. The symbols and disturbing texts were burned. The rooms that had been sealed were opened and aired. The portraits of the brides were restored, their faces no longer painted over but displayed with honor. And slowly the boys began to heal. Samuel stopped speaking in ancient languages and started studying normal Latin. Peter's constant smile became genuine, the smile of a child who found joy in simple things. And Paul finally started blinking regularly, his fever-bright awareness dimming to normal childhood curiosity. I did stay as their governess, but I became more than that. I became the keeper of their story, the guardian of their truth. I taught them mathematics and history, but more importantly, I taught them that the sins of their fathers didn't have to define them. William and I grew closer, united by the horror we'd survived. But neither of us spoke of marriage. The very word carried too much weight in that house, too much history. Perhaps someday, when the boys were grown and the memories had faded to manageable ghosts. Perhaps, James and Thomas left the manor, unable to bear the memories. They visited their sons, but they couldn't live in the place where their wives had died. Mrs. Thornwell understood. She had her own ghosts to wrestle with. One night, months later, I found a letter slipped under my door. The paper was old, yellowed, and the ink was faded, but the handwriting was elegant and clear. It was from Eleanor, somehow a last message from beyond. Dear Miss Holloway, by the time you read this, I will be long gone, passed on to whatever comes after this torment. But I wanted to thank you, not just for freeing us, but for staying, for giving our children the chance we never had, the chance to grow up free of curses and secrets. The Thornwell line is not cursed anymore. You broke it with your courage and your compassion. But remember, evil like Silas's doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the desire for power, for immortality, for control over death itself. Guard against it. Teach the boys to be better. And if you do marry William, and I hope you do, for he needs someone strong like you, know that you have my blessing. Love is not enough to conquer evil, but it's enough to build a life on, after the evil is gone. Be well, be happy, and be free. Eleanor Thornwell. I kept that letter, tucking it away with Eleanor's locket, which William had retrieved from the ruins of the tower. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I could swear I felt them. Not as the tortured spirits they had been, but as gentle presences, watching over their children, finally at peace. Thornwell Manor still stands in those Kentucky hills. It's no longer the place of horror it once was, though locals still cross themselves when they pass. The tower was never rebuilt. Nothing will grow on that circle of glass, and sometimes on stormy nights, you can see lights dancing above it, not threatening but almost celebratory, like souls dancing in their freedom. The boys grew up to be good men, breaking the cycle of their family's dark history. They became doctors, teachers, builders, professions that gave life rather than taking it. They married for love, and their wives lived long, happy lives, bearing children who knew nothing of curses and dark rituals. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I remember that night. I remember the feeling of Eleanor's spirit passing through me, the sight of Silas crumbling to dust, the sound of the tower collapsing into nothing. And I remember the lesson that place taught me. Some families carry darkness like an inheritance, passed down through generations like a poisoned heirloom. But darkness isn't destiny. With courage, with sacrifice, and sometimes with a governess who refuses to run when any sensible person would flee, even the deepest curse can be broken. The Thornwell curse is ended. The brides are at peace. The children are free. And I remained at Thornwell Manor for 40 years, watching over generations of children who grew up knowing the truth of their heritage but not being defined by it. I write this account now in my old age as a warning and a hope. A warning that the desire for power over death leads only to horror, and a hope that even the darkest curse can be broken by those brave enough to face it with truth, courage, and love. The storms still come to those Kentucky hills. The forest still presses close around the manor. But the shadows no longer whisper. The mirrors reflect only what stands before them. And the dead, finally, rest in peace.